In order to properly tell the story of the Cog Railway, we have to go all the way back to the early 1800s. We'll talk about a man whose name was Sylvester Marsh, who was born in 1803, and he lived until 1884. He was a merchant and an inventor. He ended up designing the Mount Washington Cog Railway with his patented Marsh Cog or Marsh rail system. Marsh was essentially what you'd call a workaholic, and he made most of his fortune in the beef industry in Chicago. And he worked pretty much every day of the week and as many hours a day as he possibly could. He did this for years and years until he eventually got sick, and the doctors at the time said the best that they pretty much the standard advice they told everybody back then was go get some fresh air. Now, understand in the 1850s there was no real good way to get to the top of Mount Washington. There wasn't really any established trails or roads or especially a railroad. So the only way to get up there was pretty much to figure out how to navigate your way up there. In fact, the Native Americans thought it was full of evil spirits, and anybody who went up there was pretty much going to meet their maker. So it was pretty well avoided in the 1850s. Nonetheless, Marsh decided to ascend Mount Washington in 1852 with some of his friends. He got lost not too far from the top. Fortunately, he did make his way back out. At that time, decided he'd try to build a railroad to the summit. He thought, he could do it and make a profitable endeavor doing it. And he was an inventor. He'd invented some different things to process meat and grain. And so he was able to get a charter for the railroad on June 25th, 1858. Unfortunately, the Civil War didn't really help his endeavor very much, and so he wasn't able to do any action until May of 1866. The construction of the railroad was pretty much regarded as impossible, and it became known as Crazy Marsh. Indeed, the legislature of New Hampshire granted him a charter. They further expressed their willingness to grant a charter to the moon, if he wished. Notwithstanding all opposition, Marsh persisted in building the railroad, relying chiefly on his own resources, and he did receive little capital investment until an engine was actually running over part of the route. The peculiar form of locomotive, known as a cog rail, and the brakes used were invented by Marsh. The Cog Railway was opened formally on August 14, 1868, and as far as Jacob's Ladder, and entirely completed in 1869. During that construction, it was visited by a Swiss engineer who took away drawings of the machinery and track, in which a similar railway, the Rigi Railway, was built up on Mount Rigi in Switzerland. So up here, most people just call it the Cog, and it was the first mountain climbing Cog Railway, which is a rack and pinion railway. It climbs Mount Washington in New Hampshire, and it uses the Marsh rack system. It's both steam now and biodiesel powered, which basically it runs on French fry oil. Most of the time it runs on the biodiesel, but they do use the steam on occasion. Unfortunately, there's only, I think, 2 of the steam locomotives still in service. I think there were 9 or 10 that were built. They were built in, I believe, Manchester Locomotives Works in Manchester, New Hampshire. They used to build a lot of steam engines there, and I'm 99% sure that most of the steam engines that went up the Cog Railway were built by the Manchester Locomotive Works. And a separate story for another day is there was actually another Cog Railway in Acadia National Park up here in Maine, and that closed in the early 20th century, and the trains that they had went to go to Cog Railway also. What's interesting about it is it's technically called a narrow gauge. The standard width of a regular railroad is 4 foot 8.5 in between the rails, and the reason it's 4 foot 8.5 is because that's about the width of a horse when they needed to make the rails for the horse-drawn trolleys back before they had the electric trolleys or the regular steam trains. They put rails down and had horses haul the trolleys. So 4 foot 8.5 was about the width of a horse they needed to get in between the rails, and the Cog Railway is 4 foot 8. So instead of 4 foot 8.5, it's 4 foot 8. So it's the second steepest rack railway in the world. The Pilatus Railroad in Switzerland has an average grade of 25% and maximum grade of 37%. This railway is about 3 miles long and ascends Mount Washington's western slope. It begins at an elevation of about 2,700 feet above sea level and ends just short of the mountain's summit peak of 6,288 feet. Interestingly, Mount Washington was the tallest mountain in the United States at the time. It was named Mount Washington, which was during the colonial times, because there was only 13 colonies, so Mount McKinley wasn't really known to be in existence yet. We hadn't got out there. Lewis and Clark hadn't made it out there yet. So anyway, Mount Washington was the tallest mountain in the United States back during the Revolutionary times, and even after Mount McKinley was the tallest in the United States, they just left it Mount Washington because George Washington was the first president, so they wanted to name the tallest mountain after Mount Washington, but they decided just leave it, and Mount McKinley became the tallest one. But that's another story for another day too. So the train goes at about 2.8 miles an hour and descends at 4.6. And like I said, the steam locomotives take about 65 minutes to get up there and 40 minutes back. And they have a ton of coal, and most of it's burned on the way up. And there is a water tank a little ways up because the train can't carry enough water to make it to the top, so they have to stop a little ways up and get it. But the biodiesels can get up there in about 36 minutes, and it's part of Thompson and Meserve's Purchase, with part of the railway nearest to Mount Washington summit being in Sargent's Purchase. Sargent's Purchase is just the name of the township that it sits in. So despite the railroad's incomplete state, the first paying customers started riding on August 14, 1868, and the construction reached the summit in July 1869. The early locomotives, represented today by the restored display locomotive number 1 Old Pepper Sass, all had vertical boilers, like the stationary steam engines of the time. So the boilers were mounted in the locomotive frames with twin trunnions, which allowed them to pivot. So as the locomotive started going up the grade, the gravity would keep the boiler vertically oriented, no matter what the gradient of the track was. Later designs had horizontal boilers slanted so they remained close to horizontal on the steeply graded track. In August 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant visited New England to escape the summer heat of Washington, D.C., and during his tour he rode to the top of the Cog Railway to Mount Washington. And the Cog Railway has been in continuous operation since 1869, with service interruptions only during the World Wars. After Marsh died in 1884, control of the Cog passed on to the Concord and Montreal Railroad, which ran it until 1889, when the Boston and Maine of the B&M took over. From 1868 to 1910, locomotives were all fired with wood, but in 1910 they converted to coal. Since then, it's changed hands quite a few times, and one of the most recent things they wanted to do was build a hotel, like a 35-room hotel, maybe a mile below the summit, beside the tracks, and you can imagine what kind of ruckus that caused, so that got tabled. But nothing really significant has changed a whole lot, other than they did build a passing lane instead of a spur, so they've got a passing track now. They used to just have a spur, they'd back off and then come back on the main line after the train passed, but now they got a passing line. There used to be a round table. They got rid of that, and now they've got like a slide and rail system to get into the new maintenance facility. And they did replace the rails with the old 25-pound rail with a 100-pound rail, and so it's a lot more rugged now than it used to be. In all the years of operation, there's only been 2 incidents that resulted in fatalities, and the first one happened on July 20, 1929, when they took the locomotive number 1, Old Pepper Sass, and they refurbished it, put it on the tracks, and they ran it. But unfortunately, it promptly jumped the tracks on Jacob's Ladder. It went off and landed on the right of the cog rail when the tooth broke from the gear, and the friction brake was unable to stop it from accelerating downhill. And the crew jumped off, but a photographer riding the engine to take publicity photos, his name was Daniel P. Rossiter, he fell to his death as the engine plunged off the trestle. The engine broke up into pieces, but the boiler didn't blow up. So they put the pieces back together, and now it's on display down at the base station. In 1967, 8 passengers were killed and 72 were injured when locomotive number 3 derailed at the Skyline Switch, about a mile below the summit. The engine rolled off the trestle while the uncoupled passenger car slid several hundred feet into a large rock. The investigation revealed that the Skyline Switch hadn't been properly configured for the descending train, and now a brakeman watches from the safety hazards from the leading end of the platform of the passenger car. In 1946, there was a non-fatal accident when 22 people injured. A flat car was at rest near the summit, sped up 600 feet down the track and collided with the ascending passenger train. Rack design, obviously, was Marsh's own inventions. It used a ladder-like rack with an open bar of rungs engaged by the teeth of the cog wheel. This allows the snow and debris to fall through the rack rather than lodging in it. A similar design called the Riggenback rack system was invented by Nicholas Riggenback in Switzerland about the same time. First diesel began in 2008, run on biodiesel. The train was built with the assistance of a retired mechanical engineer from the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and by 2019 the railway completed the construction of 7 of these locomotives. The track crosses over 3 hiking trails, including the Gulf Side Trail, which is part of the Appalachian Trail, and some hikers have been known to wait for the next train in order to expose their buttocks to the passengers, a practice known as mooning the cog. Several hikers have been arrested for performing this act in 2007. The railway was in operation before these trails existed and they crossed railroad property. Devil's Shingle slide boards. In the early days of the railway's construction, the workers wanted to minimize time when climbing and descending the ramp, so they invented these slide board fittings that went over the cog rack, and they provided enough room for themselves and their tools. And these boards were built individually, so there was no two exactly alike. And they were about 3 feet long and 9.5, 10 inches wide. They were made of wood with hand-forged iron, and 2 long hardwood handles that usually attached at the down mountain end. The average time for the descent of the mountain using these boards was 15 minutes, but the record was 2 minutes and 45 seconds, an average speed above 62 miles an hour. The Devil Shingles were banned in 1908 after the accidental death of an employee. However, that didn't stop the workers, and there were sources claiming the shingles were used by some up until the 1920s. Later, the design of the rack was changed so that the old braking mechanism couldn't grip anymore, so that pretty much spelled the end of that. I collected a bunch of media and I wanted to share that with you, so the rest of this video is just media that I picked up that I hope you'll find interesting. I know I did, and if you're a train aficionado like me, you'll probably like it, so hang on.
So what is a cog?
Cog, giant gear like you have on your bicycle, and it climbs the rack in the middle, kind of like a chain, and that's where we get our track. History, back then, it was about conquering things and taming the mountain.
All right, so as we come around this next bend up ahead, we'll be coming out onto Jacob's Ladder. And this is the steepest part of the tracks. The front of the coach where I'm standing is approximately 14 feet higher than the rear of the tender.